Hello and welcome to session 3 of Corset Theory. In this session, we are going to sew the Annette. I'm sewing the waspy. You might be sewing the underbust from start to finish. With any sewing project, whether it's corset or lingerie, I believe that it can take you X amount of time or half of X amount of time if you've done the proper prep work. So in this lesson, I've done a lot of the prep work, but I recommend that you do the same because it'll make your sewing go by a lot quicker. So before I get into sewing, let's go over what I've done, what supplies that you need for this lesson, and then we'll jump right into it. So in one of the previous videos, I said that in making any corset, whether it's a cupped corset, an underbust corset, a waspy corset, that when you're sewing it, there are the fronts, the middles, and the backs. And you work on those pieces separately, and then towards the end, you bring them all together. So that is what I have done here, is that I have assembled my middles. So it's number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. I've marked them to like the numbers on them so that they don't get mixed up. They're not upside down. And then I have sewn them all with 1/4 inch seam allowance, back at the beginning to end. I aligned the waistlines and I sewed upwards and then downwards. I have also sewn the back and then the back facing to it. Same thing, 1/4 inch seam allowance, back at the beginning to ends. And I sewed it a 1/4 inch seam allowance because I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance to my pattern. Let's just say you added 3/8 or 1/2 inch, then you'll sew it with those seam allowances. I haven't sewn the fronts together because the first step that we will do is inserting the busk, but I do have the front, which is pattern piece number 1, as well as the facing, which is 1A. Another prep work that I did was that if you are using self-made binding, I cut these into strips, and then I use this awesome binding maker to press them and pre-fold them, so that all I do when I go to finish it is I just fold it like that and I stitch it. Really easy, game changer when it comes to making bias bindings, making and sewing bias bindings. So I have my busk, which obviously you'll need for the center fronts. I also have my flat steel as well as my spiral steel. I always suggest getting the size that you think you need, as well as one size up and one size down. You might make changes. You might sew something too short, too bigger than what it is. And it's always great to have a variety of lengths of your boning so that you can go up and down and not get stuck in a project because you have to wait to get more boning. I also have my twill tape. So my twill tape will become my boning channels in the corsets. I have my ribbon, boom, 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 that is for the waist stay. The other supplies that you will need is thread, which 100% cotton thread I suggest because it does not stretch. It is the strongest. A universal needle, the size will depend on the thread that you are using. And also, what I don't have here, and then what I am not going to demonstrate in this video, is how to set your grommets, because how you set your grommets is specific to what grommet setter that you have. So you might have an industrial press, you might have a hand press, you might have a prim hand press, you might have a different vent. So every single vendor, manufacturer of a hand press, look at those directions and follow those directions, because I don't want to tell you to do it on industrial press, but you only have a hand press, and then you get confused. Okay, so those are all of the supplies that we have, the prep work that I did. So let's go into the first step. So I'm going to take my middles and I'm going to put those aside for right now. Let's first do the hardest step and just get that over with, which it's not even really that hard. But we're going to have our 2 front pieces, which is pattern piece number 1, if you're making the waspy, and then you have your facings. So if you are a bra maker, your hooks will go on the same side as a hook on a hook and eye closure. So if you are looking at the corset, your hooks go on this side and your studs go on this side. And if you'll notice on a busk that these studs are a little bit closer to one side, so you want that side that is closer to the edge to be towards the center front. So I'm going to put this one aside right now, focusing on the hook side, which you will notice that your busk should be about 3/8 of an inch, 1/2 of an inch from the top and bottom. If it is not, then you won't be able to put on your bindings at the end. So you want to make sure there is some wiggle room at the top as well as the bottom. So what you are going to do is mark, since I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance to this edge, I'm going to place it so that place the busk so that it is a 1/4 inch from this edge. Then I'm going to draw a line. And then I'm going to draw perpendicular lines that will indicate the opening of the studs. Sorry, the hooks, not the studs. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew from the top So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew from the top 1/4 inch down to the perpendicular line, back stitch. Then I'm going to go down here. I'm going to sew again, back stitching at beginning and the ends. And then I'm going to back stitch from this opening to this opening, back stitching at beginning and ends, and so on. So you're basically stitching in between those gaps, back stitching in between them. Okay, I sewed in between the openings, back stitching at beginning and ends. I usually just do it in one continuous strip and then snip the thread tails in between. And then I also went ahead and on the stud side, I just sewed quick 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitch at beginning and ends. Went ahead and did that, really easy step. So what you're gonna do is insert the busk in between the two layers. And this is the right side. So this should be facing towards the exterior of the garment. This is considered the wrong side of the busk. Now off camera, I'm gonna go press it so that it's really nice and crisp and the edge of the busk is right along that seam line. Okay, so my busk is inserted on the hook side. I press it so that it's really nice and flush with that edge. How you finish the facing is really gonna be up to you. So you can serge this and just use a zipper foot and top stitch here. If you are inserting a waist stay, you will wait till the end. When you are inserting the waist stay, the last place that you insert it is at the front, and then you will finish this edge. You'll finish the waist stay in this edge. You can serge it if you want. If you want to fold it back, you can do that and use a zipper foot to sew really nice and clean. I'm not going to do it right now. We'll do it later in the sew along, but I did want to mention that because you're probably wondering, how do I finish this edge? So to get the stud side, what you will do is you will lay the hook side over the center front edge, and I press this side as well, over the center front edge, making sure that the center fronts line up at the top and bottom. and then you will mark the holes. And if you look at the hook side, you want to be marking it right at this point, not right at this point. So you want to be on the right side and marking as close to that edge of the opening as possible when you're laying it over. All right, so I marked the openings. Then you are going to use your awl to push the fabric and create the openings for the studs. Question that I always get is why do you use an awl versus a hole punch? So a hole punch actually cuts the fabric. So if you have fabric that tends to fray, it will fray like crazy. So what an awl does is actually just, it doesn't tear the fabric. It just pushes the fabric to the side. It's a little bit more difficult to get the studs in, but with that pressure, especially when you put on a corset with the reduction, it will fray a lot more. So you don't want to actually cut the fabric, you just want to push the fibers aside so you can get the studs in. And after you get the studs in, it kind of like wraps around the stud and it's a really nice clean finish. So I've made my holes and then I will put in my studs, my stud side of the bust. And it might take some maneuvering to push those fibers or those threads and get that hook in or that stud in, but it will go in. Okay, studs are in. And I just want to make a note that it's through the main fabric only. It's not through the seam allowances. And then I'll fold that back. And then I'm not going to worry about it now that our fronts are assembled. I'm going to worry about finishing this edge once we get to the end, and it will depend on whether you have a waist day or not. But for the most part, the fronts are assembled. So let's move on to the back and then we'll go on to the middles. Also, when you put this on, when you clasp this, if this hook side overlaps the other side just a hair, like a 1/16 of an inch, that is okay, because once you put some tension on it and tight lace it, or lace it down, or lace it up, whatever lacing you are doing, it will become flush once you have that pressure on. Okay, let's move on to the back. So I sewed the back facing to the back. And the next thing that I'm going to do is sew the stitches, the line of stitches that I will use, that will create the boning channels for the back. So the key thing is that you're going to stitch as close to that edge as possible. So like a 1/16 of an inch. Then you are going to sew about 3/8 of an inch away from that 1/16 of an inch, then a half, then a 1/16. What I find really helpful is that if you are new to corset making, is when you go to sew it, actually put the boning down and eyeball like, okay, I need to stitch right here in order for me to be able to fit the boning in after I sew these steps. Because a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll try to get like exactly 1/4 inch, but it needs to be a little bit wider because your boning is 1/4 inch. So it's really like 5/16, 3/8 of an inch. So when you are sewing these lines of stitching, I would recommend putting down your boning so that you have enough room to insert them at the end, because there is no worse feeling than sewing all those lines of stitching and going to inserting this and be like, oh my God, it doesn't fit. And then having to seam rip, and it's not fun. So I'm going to sew all those lines of stitching, and they are marked on your patterns as well. Back stitching at beginning and end. There's a lot of back stitching in corsets, and I know that a lot of people don't clip their threads until the end of a project, but it gets very hairy. So that's okay on your muslin, but if you have the time and the patience, I really recommend clipping your thread tails at every step. It'll just make your corset so much nicer at the end. Okay, so I have sewn the lines of stitching on the back piece. Now, why did I sew this line of stitching a 1/16 of an inch from the edge? It really isn't necessary, but it does give a really crisp edge to that center back. When I was sewing it, I laid this down so I would make sure that this would fit inside. And if it is helpful, you can lay down one of your grommets in the second like gap to make sure that your grommets will fit. So now that this, something that I didn't mention in my previous video is that the Annabelle, this was designed to be serged. So if you have, I'm not doing it for this tutorial, but if you have your serger, you can serge this edge. It just gets really bulky if it's sewn into the pattern piece number 5, and also if you fold it back, it gets really bulky because you have this folded back and then you have a seam here, so it gets really bulky. So this is drafted so that it is serged. So if you have a serger, do that before you sew all of these stitches. Again, I like to clean up my thread tails because corsets can get very hairy. So I'm going to quickly sew the center back pieces to the middle pieces. So now we have our fronts assembled, we have our backs assembled, and we have our middle assembled. Now we're going to bring it all together. So this is pattern piece number 5. So this goes here. And then this will go here. I'm going to quickly sew those together. 1/4 inch seam allowance, back to the beginning, just like the rest of them. Okay, so my backs are attached to my middles. I pressed all the seam allowances open. Even though we'll be pressing them to one side in the next step, I think that pressing them open first gives a really nice crisp finish. Some true corset makers do not believe in using steam because they didn't have steam way back in the 1700s or the Victorian era or the Edwardian era, so they tried to stay as true to the original form of sewing. I use steam. We live in 2024. Steam gives a really nice crisp finish, but if you really want to make a true historically accurate Victorian corset, you can go down that route and not use steam. Just thought I'd call that out. Okay, so the next step is that we are going to be sewing the twill tape onto the seam allowances to create the boning channels. We're going to be working from 6 to 5 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. For each line, for each seam, I would say, there are 3 lines of stitching that you are going to sew. You are first going to sew them to the seam allowances only. So you're going to flip it this way, and you're going to have the edge of the twill tape along the edge of the seam line. And then you're going to be sewing as close to that edge of the channeling or the twill tape as possible. You are not sewing over your original stitch line. Then you are going to press it towards the center front, and you are going to be sewing an edge stitch. Just like the stitch along the back edge, it is not necessary. This stitch is definitely not necessary. But what happens if you don't have this stitch is that it can have like a little bit of directional sewing. So by sewing that edge stitch, you get a really, really, really nice crisp finish. Turn back, turn over from that fabric. This is the same method that we use in bra making to apply channeling to the wire seam line. So if you are a bra maker, this step will be very familiar to you. And then the third step is to sew along the other side of the twill tape. Now you can do, the first step you have to do it with the wrong side facing up because you have to see it. The edge stitch, you can do it from the right side facing up or from the wrong side facing up, whatever is more comfortable to you. And then the third stitch, again, you can do it from the wrong side facing up or the right side facing up. If you are inserting the waist stay, then the waist stay is not sewn down, it is floating in between the boning channels. So what I would do is, if I'm sewing the first one, what I would do is I would sew it underneath on this one, and you would sew it down. And then you would press it forwards and then sew it down again. When you see the finished one, it's a lot easier to visualize, but basically when you sew each channeling, you tuck the waist stay underneath. The waist stay should align with the bottom edge of your waistline from boning channel seam to boning channel seam. I'm going to do it on one side. On the other side, I'm not going to do it, but I do want you to see it and see me sewing it. But it is very tedious, and I don't want this tutorial to turn into 2 hours long. Channels have been sewn. On this side, I did the waist tape. So inside, when I went to apply each channeling, I tucked the stay underneath, and then I sewed the boning channeling on top. Again, the waist stay is below that waistline, and it's floating in between each boning channel. All of these seam allowances are pressed towards the center front. In normal garment making, a lot of times those seam allowances are pressed towards the back. The reason being is that because you work from back to front to sew the waist stay, and then in the front you tuck it underneath the facing. Now I have just cut my facing and just tucked it under and sew this down, but how you finish your facing edge will be up to you. You can either serge it, you can fold it under and then put the waist stay inside and then encase it, but again, it will be up to you. Just for the sake of this tutorial, I just kind of left a raw edge there, but you can see that the waist tape is inserted in between. And then in the regular one, if you're not sewing a waist stay, you still sew it the same way, still press seam allowances towards the front. You technically don't have to. You can press seam allowances towards the back because there is no waist stay encased in it, so that is completely up to you. Now, before I insert the boning, I like to add the binding on the top or the bottom edge, then insert the boning, and then add add the binding to the other edge. You're just less likely that you're going to break a needle. So I have already prepped my binding. And what you will do is you will apply the binding whichever way you want to do. If you've used a binding maker and you just want to sew it in one swoop and fold it over, you can. If you want to sew it to one side and then flip it to the other side and do a stitch in the ditch, you can do it that way as well. So I'm going to leave how you apply your binding up to you. But what I do want to go over is how you finish the ends. Now there are two ways you can finish the ends. You can sew a seam here and then wrap it around and then have a really nice finished edge on the top. It can get really bulky, so I don't like to do that. What I like to do is I like to leave a little bit of a tail, which it'll be much easier to see once I finish it. And then I wrap that around to the back. And then I just do a straight stitch and tack it down. So let me sew it, and I'll show you the finished results, and then it'll make a lot more sense. Binding has been sewn to the top edge. As you can see here, I just wrapped it around, sewed a straight stitch back and forth, and then I'm going to trim close to that stitch line. You can add a little bit of fray check if you want to. And then at the back, I just did the same thing, and then I'll trim close to that stitch line. And now it's time to insert the boning in all the channels. Remember that we use the flat steel boning for the back edge, for the boning channels on either side of the eyelets, and then the spiral steel in all the other ones. Once all of your boning is in, then you will sew your binding on the other edge. other edge of the corset is finished with the binding. I didn't add the grommets or the eyelets because how you apply them or insert them will depend on what type of hand press you are using, as well as what type of studs you are using or grommets. And then I demonstrated how to lace up in one of the previous videos. So that is sewing the Annabelle from start to finish. Hopefully it makes a lot more sense. If it doesn't, feel free to add any comments, questions in the chat box or comment box below.